Welcome to episode 233 of Hot Media, entitled The Perils of Propaganda. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program. I'm Bob Mann. And for those of you who have followed us as an audio podcast for the past year and a half, you realize that our mission is to discuss the hottest controversies and the hottest content in mass media. So for those of you watching us on video for the very first time, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, but we're now looking to expand into video as well, just with the greater reach of the internet. And today we're talking about a summer book that I'm reading. I realize that many of you may be reading a romance novel or a detective story at the beach. My beach reading, I'm spending my summer with fascists this particular year. The book that I'm holding, those of you on video can see it, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. You've probably seen her on CNN. She's a well-known historian. And this book is a detailed look at dictators, authoritarians, and fascists, starting with Mussolini. And, you know, this is a situation in which this is a media issue show. So I asked Ruth if she could focus strictly just on one chapter, chapter 5, because I have to say, Ruth, that it really is just one of the absolute best pieces I have ever read on propaganda. You really covered it in just a great way. Thank you so much for being here on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about that definition of propaganda. I have had I realize now, one of the weakest definitions of propaganda ever in my media and society class at Caldwell University. Propaganda, taken from the Latin propagare, is the deliberate spreading of a cause. Well, it's a lot more on the negative, dark side than that. And if you can just give us your definition, and then we can go into that a bit.
Yeah, in the book, I define it as a set of communication strategies designed to discourage critical thinking, sow confusion and uncertainty, and persuade people that reality is what the leader says it is. And that's a definition that's suited to when there is one main strongman leader. And so the state, kind of the word they used to use is synchronize, that all of the state media organs and eventually education, they all synchronize around his messages.
When we talk about Donald Trump, and we're not going to make this all about Trump, obviously we want to have historical perspective here. But when you talk about Trump, now that Joe Biden is the legitimate, legally elected president of the United States, Donald Trump does seem to have a tremendous amount of power. Could you still, with some segments of the society, say that he is indeed still the leader? Is that fair for us to examine him as the leader, since legally and officially he is not, at least for now?
Donald Trump is the leader of the Trump cult. And he's been phenomenal. He's a very, very skilled propagandist, one of the most skilled we've had in our country ever. And this is how he's managed to convince millions of people that he is still the legitimate president, which is incredible gamble that he took, but he built it up over 4 years of his personality cult and delegitimizing elections. So the more time goes on and people will have more historical perspective, they will see how very skilled he has been. And so for that half of the country that does believe his lies about the election, he is still the president. And it's really interesting that in doing so, he manages to retain the aura around his person, because a real leader cult needs the person to be special above all other men. And if he were just defeated president, he becomes like any other mortal. This way, he strings people along and keeps the magic around him.
When you talk about a number of things in terms of lies in propaganda. You mention in your book that what we really should be doing, or not we should, a propaganda should be doing, is add that tiny element of truth. But actually, when it comes to the big lie, this is just a straight out big lie. Is there any element of truth in this that the Trump propagandists were able to pull off? For example, that, mail-in voting was being done on such a large scale for the first time. Is there any grain of truth, or is this one of these lies that's just blatant and winning the day?
Yeah, the reason it's classified as a big lie and with capital letters is that it is a complete fabrication. But for our purposes, what's interesting is the way that over 4 years and intensifying in view of the election in 2020, he and when I say he, it's him and then his GOP acolytes and Fox News. But it generates from him, managed to discredit in a very disciplined and rigorous fashion every aspect of voting. So the mail-in ballots were questioned, voters were questioned, or are dead people voting? Are people committing fraud? Election officials. So the whole apparatus around voting, every kind of voting, was discredited in a very kind of deliberate fashion. And then all of that, plus the devotion to him that he cultivates, set up the quote big lie, and he did this very, very successfully. But it was something that depended on long-term propaganda around elections.
And it's going on and will probably go on until 2025. That's the thing. This is not just a look back in history. One of the things that you mention in your chapter on propaganda is the fact that discrediting the news media, discrediting journalism is an insurance policy. Why would you see it in terms of an insurance policy?
So, most of these leaders I study many of them are criminals or under investigation when they are running for office. And if they come in via coup, because the book is divided into the fascist years, the age of military coups, and then our own time where people come through elections, so they have to run for office, right? And Hitler and Mussolini had criminal records. And of course, if they're coming in through a coup, they are doing an illegal act and there's violence and they usually kill people. So, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Silvio Berlusconi were all under investigation when they ran for office. So getting the people, anyone who can expose their crimes becomes an enemy, and journalists are high on that list. And so what they start to do is even before they get into office, and this also happened with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, they start attacking the press. So that the insurance policy is that even if they are successful and now they're the head of state, if something comes out about their corruption, right? Because nowadays, usually you still have a functioning democracy and then you try and erode it. So you have an opposition press. So if something comes out, they need their followers to already believe that the press is biased, that the press is partisan hacks, that the press is the enemy of the people. So they set this up early on. They don't wait till they're already in office because that's too late. Because as soon as somebody becomes the president, they can be subject to investigations. And this happened with Trump. So it's very interesting because let's go back to 2016. Many Americans, unfortunately, already hated people of color. They already hated migrants. And these were like traditional enemies or Muslims or Jews. But what Trump did, again, with great discipline, so he's neither crazy nor is he lazy. With great discipline, he turned his followers against the press and created hostility around them. And that's why when all the incredible investigative journalism happened during his presidency, there was a whole revival of investigative journalism. They didn't believe it. They only believed the cult leader, Donald Trump.
And no matter what they come up with, they could have a gold standard Pulitzer-winning investigation. They're all crooked anyway. They hate him. They lie. They lie. I've overheard it in restaurants. I just can't watch the CNN and the NBC. They lie. They lie so much. It's disgusting. The minds are already made up. And I guess you, in the end, fix the result. It doesn't matter what's actually in the investigation, in the report, or in the discovery.
That's right. And that's why the same was true with Berlusconi, who owned TV networks, so he had way more control. He also owned TV advertising conglomerates. But this is why people refer to them as Teflon. They are innumerable sex scandals, financial scandals, fraud. Nothing seems to touch them. And so this is also why I'm focusing, especially, I started a newsletter called Lucid, where I've been writing a lot about cults, authoritarian cults. Why do people just have this blind belief? Because once that set of circumstances is there where people don't believe the press, they blindly believe the leader, no matter what he does, it doesn't touch them. And that's where the Teflon comes in.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in is this power of personality. And as I'm reading the book, I wanted to ask you, and of course, there are so many other aspects of the book, Strongmen, other than propaganda. I'm just focusing on this because of our format. But would there have, if it hadn't been Hitler in Germany, would it have been someone else? If it hadn't been Mussolini in Italy, would it have been someone else? If it hadn't been Trump here in the US, would it have been someone else? Did it take a unique theatrical personality? Again, focusing on communication and media, does it take that ringmaster, huckster, over-the-top actor to make this happen?
It often does. And one of the things I discovered in doing the research for Strongmen is that a number of the most successful ones have a background in some form of mass communications or entertainment. So Mussolini was a really skilled journalist. He was a sloganeer. He was a great journalist, very persuasive, very passionate. Hitler was doing some journalism, but Hitler's interesting, and I have this in the book. He worked very hard on his, quote, natural charisma. He took voice lessons, he took hypnotism lessons, and he hired a photographer in the 1920s, Heinrich Hoffmann, who became his official photographer later, to take pictures of him practicing his gestures in the mirror. So all of this theatrics that Hitler's so famous for in his speeches, he worked on it for years. And then
may I just show the video audience this one very dramatic picture of Hitler?
Yeah.
It looks like something from a Saturday Night Live sketch here, where he's just over the top. You know, it's like bad cinema. This over dramatic acting from a specific German school of filmmaking and acting. And while it seems comical out of context, it was pretty powerful in a terrifying context in 1936 and beyond.
Yeah, well, so and you also can look at Mussolini, who gesticulates a lot. And you have to remember that film was silent until the early 1930s. And so these strongmen are creatures of their media age. And so both Mussolini and Hitler were responding to, and newsreels were silent too. And Mussolini was already in power throughout the whole 1920s. And so you needed to have that acting style in a way. And so if we fast forward, it's, Berlusconi was the master of TV. He was and he not only owned TV networks, he was a great entertainer. He knew exactly how to move his body. But Mobutu in the Congo, who had a military coup, he'd been a journalist too. And then, of course, Trump was in reality TV, and he's also a marketer. So each of them uses the techniques of his day to perform. And many people, when you look at testimonies of the time, many people thought Mussolini was an actor, right? And Trump is a superb actor. He's able to simulate emotion, like when he tells his followers on January 6th, "I love you." He has no empathy, he has no love for anyone but himself, but he's able to successfully act as though he has these emotions, and it's very convincing to people.
You mentioned about Mussolini being a journalist, but Mussolini's primary medium was the cinema, but not just in Italy. He actually had newsreels that were seen in the United States in which he is speaking to the American audience in English. And forgive me if I've misread this in the chapter, but William Randolph Hearst gave him a newspaper column here in the USA.
Yeah, Mussolini, this is the story. Mussolini was a global icon up until he invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and then he allied with Hitler 36, and then things got changed. Mussolini he was a huge star in the United States, and not only because there was a big Italian American population, he was backed by a lot of very powerful elites who were anti-communist, and they fell under his sway. So William Randolph Hearst gave him a syndicated column that reached like 1,000 newspapers. He was constantly on newsreels, and he in fact spoke in bad English, but he spoke in English in one of them directly to Americans. He was on the radio constantly. He had many admirers at powerful financial institutions who had informal propaganda going on for him. So he had a lot of reach directly to the American people. And in the late 1920s, he had that newspaper column from 1927 to 1935. That's a really long time.
It's kind of the Walter Winchell of Rome.
Yeah.
Very, very strange too, and especially since they jail and murder journalists, that he was actually a journalist. I've done interviews with the Committee to Protect Journalists. The idea of shutting up people in the news media is very big with dictators, and journalists are always in jeopardy. But one of the things that concerns me actually when I look at Berlusconi, somebody who owns a great deal of television. People may not realize it, but you can't actually own a television station in the United States. You get a license to make money off of a TV station. I was always thinking that if I were Donald Trump and had this power and had this strategy and was following the dictator's playbook, that I would just pull the licenses of all of these stations. I'm a little surprised that didn't happen, at least in term number 1 when he was the 45th president. It may happen if he's number 47. What are your thoughts on that? The idea that he could just shut down the networks. He might not be able to shut down newspapers, but he could definitely take the networks and the stations.
Yeah. If he didn't do it, it's because he wasn't able to do it. And I do fear if he comes back, he and all of his cohort who were planning a lot, they were planning this was a long-term project. So like Steve Bannon, they took over Voice of America they put in a Bannon acolyte, and that was very, very important for propaganda to the rest of the world. Hundreds of millions of listeners. In the States, they found it more difficult, but pulling licenses is what Viktor Orban does in Hungary. There are many ways today. So you unless you're, Putin poisons people and he imprisons people, but many of these guys today, they take a legalistic, it's called lawfare. Like you use the law against your enemies. So you find technical breaches of some regulation, or you trump up, you fabricate something, and with that, you're able to shut people down, whether it's NGOs or whether it's media outlets.
Right. And eventually, if people are not hurt themselves immediately, they just kind of go along. The bottom line here, as we come to the end of our conversation, and again, very limited, I'm not trying to limit this incredible book on dictators and authoritarians to just our subject area. But what can people do to resist propaganda, or do they probably not want to resist propaganda to begin with because it just reinforces what they want to hear?
Yeah, so there are things that we can do. I published an op-ed in the Washington Post in 2018, how to push back against Trump's propaganda. And I devote a lot of time to this in my newsletter, Lucid. And of course, one thing is that we should resist the temptation to amplify, propagandists, disinformation specialists, and they can include politicians who, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or Tucker Carlson, who have mastered outrage politics. So it can feel satisfying to denounce them, but in spreading their words, we are helping them become more prominent because of the way social media algorithms work. So we should never ever retweet them. If you must, you kind of cut and paste and paraphrase what they're saying, and then provide an argument. Another thing, and this is better if you're with someone in person or you're on a panel in TV, that I believe in, is called exposing the device. If someone gives you a false claim, it doesn't work that well to just kind of refute them giving the truth, because it becomes a he said, she said. And instead, you want to go meta in a way. You want to say, well, I see you're saying that, like, let's say, the big lie, so that Trump can stay in office and avoid immunity from and keep his immunity from prosecution. Or, you go to the higher concept, and you just resist the temptation to go back at them with evidence. And in my latest Lucid essay on disengagement from cults and disinformation, this also doesn't work, I found, in writing it, because the evidence that you're going to use, even if it's the National Institutes of Health and you're dealing with a COVID denier, they while they're under the sway of this kind of cult-like thinking, they have discounted and discredited in their minds all of those sources. So you won't get through to them that way.
Well, I'm definitely going to become a subscriber to Lucid. Can you just give the audience the ways that they can get to Lucid and be able to read these many interesting ways to deal with propaganda and to deal with the efforts to just completely undo the truth?
Yeah, it's lucid.substack, substack.com. My Twitter handle is Ruth Ben-Ghiat altogether, and it's in my pinned tweet. And you can also go to my website, which is ruthbenghiat.com. And I've really been devoting the last weeks pretty solidly, and there's other essays, Why Do People Believe Liars? Because this disinformation is the scourge of our time. And everybody, so many people have a loved one or an acquaintance who's fallen under the sway of some form of it. So it's important.
It really does make going out to dinner a very uncomfortable situation. That and now going inside to dine again, as it seems, with these new waves. I realize, Ruth, that we did not get a chance to get into the rest of the book. I wanted to focus on where our format is, but just for people who would want to pick up Strongmen, Mussolini to the present, just a couple of quick overview questions. Back in the 1960s, people would say you're a fascist pig if you supported the war in Vietnam. Obviously, that's not what a fascist is. We know what an authoritarian is. We know what a dictator is. What specifically defines being a fascist, as Mussolini was?
There isn't one definition that fits everybody, but Mussolini wants to find fascism as a revolution of reaction, and it is classically it's a one-party state with a leader cult and a dictator, and dictator is related to the word dictate, like to tell, to command, where the state, Mussolini said, everything inside the state, nothing outside the state. So you shut down opposition, you shut down freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, but fascism is a movement of mass mobilization, and so it's got a revolutionary component, but the object is a reactionary one. That's where the revolution of reaction. You want to turn back the clock on all forms of political and social emancipation. So fascists, they include some people in their community, like under Nazism, Aryans, and make them feel wanted. But the goal is to have a kind of fantasy, pure national polity. And to do that, you have to suppress everybody else.
It is frightening, but it is fascinating. And I thank you very much. I know that you get so many invitations to be on programs, and the book is fascinating reading, and I recommend it strongly. Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. Our guest, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, right here on